Hi, everybody. We started with Gestalt theories last time, and now I want to talk about actually organizing those elements and shapes on a space. So we're going to look at composition today. So composition is all about how you arrange elements for visual effect. So you can think in terms of placement and visual weight. And basically, composition is all about making space appear either static or dynamic. So static being fixed or not in motion, and dynamic is appearing active or in motion. And it happens within a defined space. And the traditional spaces are, of course, portrait and landscape. And the traditional rules then are that pictures of objects would be in a portrait orientation, and pictures of scenes would be in a landscape orientation. So generally, a portrait orientation feels more contained. The object or figure is there for us to examine, whereas a landscape feels more like there is movement and action, and we're able to look to the sides, so it's not as focused on one singular option. So generally, portrait mode feels more contained. We're seeing a thin slice of whatever area we're looking at, and we're expecting a snapshot. That's what our brain is expecting. In landscape mode feels more open. We're seeing a wide stretch of our cone of vision. We're expecting to be able to look right and left and see a lot of area. So this is why when you're taking a picture of a person, you should use portrait, and why when you're doing a video, you should always do landscape mode. So in my very introductory video where I introduced myself, I did it in portrait mode. And then all of these other videos I've done in landscape mode. You should always do videos in landscape mode. So given that, perhaps a square is a somewhat neutral compositional space. We don't see the square used much in Renaissance work. We see either traditional landscape or portrait. But in more contemporary, say modernist painting, we start to see the square chassis, like this Mondrian painting. So composition both projects and reinforces meaning in a work. And it's important to note that it's not an exact science, and sometimes it's meant to be random so that it portrays jumbled chaos, like this Dadaist composition. So there's three main approaches. There's traditional quartering and diagonals, there's the rule of thirds, and there's rabattement. And we can see that in this traditional quartering that the whole space has been quartered or divided into very logical sections. Objects tend to be placed on these diagonals. Figures tend to be placed right in the middle or on the middle vertical axes. And I use the word focal point. That's just what's emphasized in a work. So we see this as a static composition with the main character directly in the very center of the space. And derived from this is the portrait triangle. So you can see her nose, the point of her nose is right on that center point, but the rest of her is arranged in something called a portrait triangle. And this gives weight to the character, a very stable base coming up in a triangle. And we see it happen with groups of figures too sometimes. Now, dynamic space and dynamic composition often has objects and people not on those center points or vertical or horizontal lines. So we see this very dynamic image, and we can see all the action is taking place on lines not perfectly aligned with the corners of the space. This one as well, we can see all the lines showing the object placement and figure placement. Another idea, another compositional technique is the rule of thirds. So if you've ever edited or cropped one of the photos on your phone, these grids will pop up. And the idea is that important things happen on the lines or at the intersection of the lines. Now, when you get the PDF off of Canvas, there's an interesting video here that describes the rule of thirds and something called the pie grid. The third idea is called rabattement. Now, this is the idea that our brain wants to use logical and simple shapes, which the most basic would be the square. It tends to give the idea of focal points and angles of action for rectangles based on squares that make up any given rectangle. So what that means is we'll see divisions based on squares that are derived from the rectangle. So if we've got a rectangle like this, the first orders would be to find the two squares that make up those spaces. So we can see here the white line caps off the square that makes the left side of the rectangle, and the black line caps off the square that makes the right side of the rectangle. And here are some aspect ratios and how screens utilize this as well. Here's a very simple rabattement from Monet. So it's actually kind of complex and ridiculous geometry we start to see when you start to do this. And again, this lends to the fact that it's not an exact science. You end up with something like this when you get done with all of the geometry. And we see things happening on these cross lines, and the space is made up by the lines, and then focal points happening at intersections. This is really kind of the most arcane compositional theory. So here's another video you can link to and watch when you get the PDFs. So a still life is just an arrangement of objects for painting. And a lot of times still lifes are just stand-ins or excuses for painting if they're just mundane things like cups or cubes. Sometimes they are important things. So different eras of still life are for different purposes. So another idea we can impose upon these three strategies is symmetry. And I've mentioned symmetry before, but symmetry means mirroring of right and left on the radial axis. Or, I'm sorry, that's an error there. It would just be the vertical axis. Radial symmetry is sort of what's twisting out from the center in other compositions. So obviously the target is the most basic sort of symmetry, and we've got right and left symmetry, and we've got top to bottom symmetry. Very static, feels very fixed in space. They feel settled or contained or complete. We talked about symmetry when we talked about the Gestalt theories. It can get pretty complex. There's some definite imperfections here with the technique, but this is a student work and it's like what you'll be doing. It doesn't mean that they don't contain movement. It just feels like they're a bit more locked in. Now, on the other hand, asymmetrical work is not the same on the right and left halves. It tends to make our eyes move around. It tends to make our brain think, well, why is this way? Why is that way? It's a different kind of logic that maybe isn't as comfortable. It tends to imply dynamism. So it's a lot easier to get a sense of movement through an asymmetrical composition. It can get pretty complex. I really like this one. A lot of good use of the positive and negative space flipping, and a lot of good use of very basic shapes, half circles and a really narrow triangle. So static compositions tend to feel more self-contained. Dynamic compositions tend to feel like a slice of a larger event. So static compositions, symmetry, tends to feel like a very certain space, whereas dynamic asymmetrical compositions tend to feel like a very open space. Relatively static here, a lot more dynamic. You see a skull in a still life, that's memento mori, and that's a reminder of death, and that contrasts with the fertility implied by fruit. So there's quite a bit going on here actually in terms of meaning, even though maybe this is a bit old-fashioned looking to us with modern eyes. So I also want to mention crystallographic composition. And this means that there are tons of focal points positioned all over the scene. And it's really meant to make your eyes go all around. So there's not a central focal point or just a few focal points. They're all over the place. This is a very rhythmic composition. It is not a pattern, however. And we'll get to that a few videos from now. And again, this looks very common to us now. But when this was painting, this was an all new kind of thing. This sort of action painting. It's a futurist drawing using a lot of cubism here. And so just a few examples again of what the assignment will be and some motivation for you. And there we've got the asymmetrical composition up on the left, and the negative space from this has been used to create the symmetrical composition on the right. So we'll be discussing how you'll find the shapes to create the symmetrical composition. Okay, so next video, I'll do a little demo on how we'll do the assignment, and I will talk to you later.